kick off tonight's Evenings with Artifacts. This is our spring finale. Good evening. My name is Heather Nickerson, co-founder and CEO of Artifacts. I'm joined tonight with my co-founder and co-host, Ellen Goodwin, along with three amazing panelists for our season finale. Tonight, we're going to be talking all about collections. If you caught our post on social media today, you'll know there's a risk where collections are concerned. Is it actually a personal collection, or have you been victimized by stuff? Whether you have intentionally curated collections or have some accidental collections, during this episode of Evenings with Artifacts, we'll dive into the world of collections. Joining us tonight, we have Sarah Reeder. Sarah is a certified member of the Appraisers Association of America and a certified member of the International Society of Appraisers. In her role as CEO of Artifactual History, Sarah prepares appraisal reports of fine art, silver, furniture, ceramics, antiques, and decorative arts for insurance coverage, estate purposes, and other intended uses. Sarah is also a specialist and scholar of mid-century modern and 20th century design, and last year published her first book, Ray Eames in 1930s New York. She is part of a scholarly team at TOAD Archive, a privately curated digital archive that explores historical textiles, objects, and documents from the mid-century modern design period. Welcome, Sarah. We also have joining us tonight, Gina. We originally met Gina through professional channels, but have come to know her still better through her prolific artifacting of her incredibly unique personal collections. Tonight, she's offered to share with all of us the importance of one of her collections to movement overall and what it meant for the artist whose work is featured in her collection. Welcome, Gina. And last but not least, we have Tanzy Ward. Tanzy is a dedicated preservationist, or dedicated to preservation and education related to antique jewelry and historical material culture. She is committed to incorporating the Black diaspora into antique jewelry representation. Tanzy, we're thrilled you're joining us tonight. And with that, we're going to kick off tonight's evening series. We're going to start with Sarah and dive into a really broad question to start, Sarah. For you, what is a collection and what makes a collection?
Thank you, Heather. Heather and Ellen, I'm so honored to be here. And I love this question because often people think that a collection is a very tightly defined, thing. And it's not at all. Like, we have so much power in how we interpret our meaning of a collection. So I'm excited to be able to unspool that a bit tonight. Often, I loved the Instagram posts you all had tonight. And if anyone here isn't already following Artifacts on Instagram, you should be. Because it was so perfect for me, because I can't actually talk about the specific things I appraise due to client confidentiality rules. So the roosters in the Instagram post today was perfect, because I can now substitute the roosters for the same dynamic that I see in a lot of my client work, where someone, if they think, okay, it's a collection needs to be a lot of one type of thing, which it can be. People think about a collection like it's 15 roosters, and then that fact that there's so many of them, that's what makes it a collection. But it doesn't have to be that at all. A collection can be very, very small. It doesn't need to be the same type of item. It really is a grouping of things that we choose. And that intent and that discernment is what makes it really fun. And sometimes when we lose or forget that we have that power to apply that intent and discernment, that's when you start to feel victimized by your collections, where the things are controlling you rather than you are actively making a choice because it's going to achieve something really specific that's important to you, or is going to add to the impact of your goals. And so often a lot of people I work with, they think collecting means I need to have a cabinet of roosters, or, and one rooster isn't a collection, but 50 are. And if you want 50 roosters, go for it. But the real point is this making you happy? Is it, sparking the joy, as people say? It doesn't have to be like that at all. And often when people, they start with something that they may really enjoy, and then suddenly they become known for its it becomes something that takes control, has a life outside of them, and that's when people get really stressed out, and they call me and they're like, I have all this stuff that got out of hand, and it doesn't have to be like that. To collection is really just a form of creative control that we all have, where we can say, this cause is important to me, this historical moment is important to me, this art movement is important to me, and I'm going to explore and engage with that in a way that brings me a lot of joy and also is achieving the outcome that's important to me. And that can be with two pieces. It's all, we have the power.
Sarah, you said beautifully when we were prepping for this show that there can be no curation without intention. And so I think that's something really that, and I will give another silly rooster-like example of this for you to jump into. So in the TV show Ted Lasso, I don't know how many fans of you there are out there, but there is a character in the show, later third season, who collects snow globes. But the snow globes, she has to purchase them herself. And there's other conditions she creates. Like, I have to be leaving a location. I can't live there and buy a snow globe that relates to that location. Like, she creates conditions that help her curate that collection for herself. So I think your point about you can't have curation without intention is a really important one.
Yes, and that it's, you are not just having to be receiving other people's things, which, that's a topic I know you engage with a lot with artifacts. Like, how do you deal with the things that are not necessarily yours and figuring out the meaning in them? But yeah, like with the snow globes, it sounds like in this, and I have to confess, I've never seen that show. So I'm speaking, I know, travesty, but that it's linked with the travel, it's linked with the experiences and being in a specific place and time. It's not just snow globes. And so that's the meaning, that's the finding the why. And that, I think, is also like, and I will say, sometimes when people are like, I had 2 snow globes and now everyone gives me snow globes and I have 1,000 of them and I'm really stressed out, you can tell people how they can show care to you. Like for example, say, don't give me snow globes. Like, I really care about animals. Donate to animal welfare, or donate to Komen, or, go take it higher level to the why and the intent and what is that impact that you're really hoping to achieve. And that can be achieved also in the stories that you tell through specific objects that you select and curate and put together and then share that story, that in their inner dynamic, they're kind of greater than the sum of their parts. And that's where I think I would really like to challenge people's thinking about a collection as a bunch of the same type of things, to then say, well, what if you got different things, very distinctly different things, and how they interrelated with each other? What kind of story would that tell? Because each time you add in a new element, it's expanding the perspective of the stories you can tell.
I love that, Sarah. We've heard you speak in the past about the investment in your impact in collecting. But there's also something about the happiness and the sense of self in collecting. Can you elaborate a bit further on that for our audience tonight?
Absolutely. As a person who loves art, I've really experienced firsthand how living with art in my personal space has such an important neurofeedback element. Like, being surrounded by beauty and things that I enjoy looking at, and every day I get to look at them and I go, oh, that's so beautiful. I'm so glad I get to see that. It changes kind of your biochemistry. And I feel like that's something that people don't realize or don't give themselves the permission to even feel worthy of doing that. Sometimes it's like, oh, well, this is, I don't, art really is for everyone. I'm always very passionate about art is for everyone. It doesn't need to be out of reach or elitist. We all can benefit from having collections that bring us happiness and meaning to live with, and how then that also shapes the impact, reminds us of what our values are, what our philosophies are, what kind of impact do we want to go out in the world each day and work towards. And it can be a really powerful way of centering that by literally kind of feathering our nest with these things that amplify what is most important to us. And that's where I think that intent, it cycles back in, where it's you choosing and you saying, this, I'm bringing this in because, the why, and we can, I think Artifacts is great for helping people figure out the why. So we can dive into that too.
So in professionally speaking, how you're talking about feathering the nest and bringing stuff in, but that has to work in the reverse then too. Do you help people who have collections maybe thin them out when they are feeling overwhelmed? Like, there has to be the reverse, right? The philosophy, the impact, the guidance can help you get rid of some things here and there.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the collectors I work with, they really actively fill that deaccession role too. In my firm, I tend to not be directly involved in that. I kind of help them with the background research of their options and things to consider. But it's, yeah, the other really beautiful thing about when you get very, very clear on your why, like, why am I collecting? What do I want this collection to achieve? What is the story of this collection? What are the parameters of what I want in that collection? Then the things that don't fit it becomes really obvious. It's like, oh, well, I might have purchased this thing early on because I really didn't have the clarity yet on what I wanted to achieve. Or maybe I didn't yet realize that I could do this instead. But then it's a constant process of honing your vision. And it's that inner work too, because when you are deciding what's important to you, it involves, asking yourself what's important to you, which sometimes is pretty difficult. We may not want to even face those answers. There's a shadow work to collecting, which I feel like people don't talk about a lot, but it can be so, so beneficial to really engage with it and view it as the gift that it is, where when you are kind of reflecting on your growth as a collector. And I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Spencer W. Stewart, who's a Canadian collections advisor. He's really shaped my thinking about this. He talks about the life cycles of collecting, which I think is a great way to visualize it, where in Spencer's concept, it's early on, people are kind of still in that. They haven't really quite figured out where they're going yet, but they know they want to be a collector. There's that middle range where they're getting that clarity and applying those filters. And then there's kind of that late stage collector where they're thinking, what is my legacy? Like, what am I going to do with this? How can I make sure that this is portable to maintain the impact that I wanted it to achieve? And so I think that inner work of figuring out, what do I want my collection to be and tell and achieve? It involves a lot of figuring out what's important to you. And that is such a, really, really powerful exercise that is, open to all of us. And these don't have to be expensive objects. That's something I always really want to underscore to people. We don't need to be at the May sales, spending millions of dollars on artworks. Like what's going on is, we're recording it this week. It can be things that cost very, very little money, but they are telling stories that are important to us, or they're contributing to an impact that is important to us personally. And that is just as valid as the multi-million dollar canvases.
That life cycle concept resonates very much with me. And one of my favorite articles that we've had over time is titled, and Heather will put it into chat, because who wants 300 miniature pianos? And this is the legacy side of things. Like, are you really going to give your daughter 300 miniature pianos? And how is she going to feel about that? How is her spouse going to feel about that? And if it's not going to be a rosy kind of scenario, how do you convey then, these are the most important to me? These are actually valuable. These 20 over here, like how you convey that actually is the legacy component. I think maybe helps you thin it out, but also helps, as you're saying, in that phase. And I think that's something that we're also very cognizant of here.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah, and then do those 300 pianos, does each piano tell a different part of that story? Is it like each year a miniature piano was made? Like that's a collecting question, as one is building a collection. Like if I'm adding one more miniature piano, what is this doing to add to the story, or is it adding to the story? And I know you recently have introduced your QR code stickers, and so I love Ellen, your phrase, is it sticker worthy? Because that is forcing people, like, what's the why? Like, why is this piece part of the collection? What facet is it telling in the story that nothing else in the collection is telling? And sometimes, like when I have collectors I work with who are getting ready to deaccession certain things, it's because they've really taken stock of where the holes in their collection, and they realize, oh, I have 3 of this but none of this, and so they might sell 2 of them to buy the thing that is the missing hole. But it's because they know what that hole is, because they've done that inner work to figure out what story they want it to tell. And then that's the other part of artifacting too, that I think it's like, what's the story? Like, why is this here? why am I artifacting this? It's a great, I think that using the Artifacts platform is a great way for people to, if at first it seems overwhelming, because it often does when you're thinking about a collection, just sort of diving in item by item, like, why is this important to me? What are my memories of it? And then through that data, which you kind of aggregate bit by bit, then the story can emerge. So I think for people who are like, oh my gosh, I'm so overwhelmed, what do I do? I would say, for the pieces that you have, just start artifacting them, because then that thread of story is going to emerge, and the thread of the story may be your meaning through it all.
That's a
So
great.
I was just, oh, sorry.
Go ahead,
I
Ellen.
was just in a meeting, and this woman, she's an estate attorney, and she was saying to me that one of the things that she wants us to talk about more with people is, if they are artifacting collections, and it doesn't have to be artifacting, but if they're documenting their collections, what are the, like, do not forget to include this information, right? Like, what, and I think that that's coming from a couple places. The story component is what we think from a person to person level is going to matter, right? If my mom tells me this sweet story or this amazing story, whatever, about some object, I'm going to care more about it than it came from Target, right? Like, it's going to inherently be more interesting. If it's more interesting if it's Bon Jovi's jacket than a jacket, like, right? The story matters. But I think she's also looking at from the perspective of what we talk a lot about, the reason we have the what's it worth button. At some point, if you didn't document it all properly, someone's going to have to make sense of it all. And part of the sense might be which of these are valuable financially and we should actually sell, versus we could donate these, or we could just, free cycle them or something like that. Like, do you have any advice for people that have collections and want to start being more thoughtful about what records they're keeping? Like, what's the bare minimum?
Oh, I love this question, because this is going to make my job easier. I would say the provenance, which can be part of the story, but like specifically the provenance in terms of, where did you get this? Who did you buy it from? Was it given to you? How much did you pay for it if you bought it? Like, that alone can be so helpful in an estate situation to quickly identify the higher value items. If something was purchased for $10,000, well, okay, yeah, that you need to worry about that item, versus I got it at Target, you probably don't need to worry about that. So if you have the receipt, I know people can upload the receipts. That will be like, appraisers of the world, thank you. If we can get our hands on the receipts, I always ask for receipts. I rarely ever can get my hands on them. So, for those, just even if you don't have the receipts, if it's your collection and you remember, I got it from this dealer 10 years ago for about $200, type that in. Like, we will love seeing anything like that. And that is also really important for kind of the liquidity of collections too. This is not I don't work with sales, I just appraise in my firm, but a lot of times people do need to sell certain items, and so having it documented in that way is going to make it so much more appealing for it to be sold, because it's not an unknown. It's not going to take a ton of time to kind of tease through it and figure out what's important and what's not, because often for large collections there's a big range in value. And so it can be very, very time consuming to not miss something important and, really doing that research. Whereas if all the receipts were there, we're good to go. So I would say, bare minimum, please, please, please put in that the purchase acquisition, which also, in terms of like cost basis, cap, all that kind of estate attorney stuff, I'm not qualified to talk about. Like, it's important for that too.
And it's funny, we had an article, we talked with Lark Mason, he's from a host on Antiques Roadshow, and he said, I can tell you the era it's from, I can tell you how it was used, I can tell you who created it, I can tell you all of that. I can't tell you about the provenance, I can't tell you how it came to be in your hands. The family lore might be all you have, and you should keep that as with it as well, because that, my grandmother gave it to me might be all you know, but that's more than he's going to know. He's going to know it came from 1600s, China and this provenance and etc. Right? But like, you have to take an active participation role in your own collection.
Yes. And even some of those details, like knowing it was from someone's grandmother, sometimes then you can really dive into the genealogy, which I know you've got a lot of great genealogists in the Arti community, and then figure out, oh, that grandmother was serving in China, in this time period when all this great stuff was happening. I mean, you can, it not always, but having those biographical details can be really helpful for provenance specialists to flesh out that research later.
That's wonderful, Sarah. Thank you so much for that overview on collections, and also, I think, raising some of those key points we don't often always think about when we hear the term collections, or even when we're staring at our own stuff thinking, I've got a growing collection on my hands. So that was very useful. Thank you. And with that, I want to turn us over to Gina. So Gina is an Artifacts community member. Again, we've met her through professional channels, but she very quickly took to artifacting, tremendous collections, and has eagerly agreed to share the why behind one of her, I think, favorite collections of Polish posters. And she's going to jump in and share with us and kind of open up her collection and her artwork to all of us tonight. So welcome, Gina.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. And Sarah just said so many things that are just buzzing in my head. I'm so excited. As Heather mentioned, I have a collection of Polish film posters, which is very odd, I know. Most people say to me, are you Polish? And of course I am not, but it's the why. And when I was young, I wanted to invest in something, and I went to a gallery in New York, which is Chisholm Larson, which is still there. And I wanted one big poster for my room, for my apartment in New York. And instead, I found this small little, very delicate poster that just spoke to me. And I said, oh, it's just so adorable and it makes me so happy. And then I realized I started unfolding it. And it was one of those things where I started to learn where these artists, this was the work that they had to do. They had no other work after World War II. And so they were able to take American films and interpret them. And there's lots of little hidden things. There's lots of silliness and joy and humor. And it became almost like a puzzle. Like I was putting together why did they draw this for this movie? It has nothing to do with the film, but it was their art, and it was a way of kind of winking at the government and being somewhat political while being whimsical. And it was almost, it's funny because when Heather opened, it's an accidental collection that has now become very intentional and very curated. I don't let people buy them for me. I have to buy them myself because they have to speak to me. I'm going to turn my computer around, and I hope not to make anyone dizzy. I'm going to do it very delicately, but you'll see that this wall in my office has a number of posters, and they're all hung very intentionally in color story in the years that they're there. And one of the things that resonates also with something that Sarah said, I have several more. And every so often, I'll do a swap. And it will just hit me that I need something new, or I go through them, they're all in storage, and I'll say, oh my God, I forgot how much I love this. And I'll put it back up. And it's joy. It's absolute joy. And I feel like I find something new in them all of the time. it introduced me to films. It introduced me to different actors that I'd never heard of. And just for what it's worth, these were all done between the 50s and the 70s. I only collect original. And what they were used for is they would swipe them up in subways and on, poles and walls. They're very, very, very fine and thin, and they're vibrant colors. And it was just one of those things. And what's funny too is that my history is I spent 20 years working for a movie studio, and seeing how they do it now, and they put out a film and they just change they change the language, where I've literally stared at one of these and said, how did they get from that movie to this storyline? So absolute joy, total fun. I love discovering something in a new poster. I still have several in tubes that I've actually artifacted my tubes of posters of ones that I haven't framed yet because I'm out of wall space. But that's the other thing about artifacting is I sat down and I took a lot of time with them, and I did the translation and what year and who's in the film and who directed it. But it reminded me of why I bought each one. And it reminded me of where I found them. And it reminded me, like, for example, this one is hung specifically because I love seeing it on Zoom, because I spend a lot of time on Zoom calls. This was absolutely destroyed and I had it restored. And it's these things. And so when I was artifacting all of it, it just came kind of flooding over me about how important this collection is. And so that's another reason I was so excited to kind of talk about them. It's such a beautiful movement, the Polish artists. And the other thing I was going to mention is you might know more Polish art than you think. There's a contemporary person. His name is Rafał Olbinski, and he does every poster for the New York Film Festival, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he's a Polish artist who specializes in, it's almost optical illusion. But he's still current, where most of the other ones are either professors now in Poland or so. But again, accidental, it has become intentional and curated. So
I love how it started though with something that I think is natural, and Sarah addressed it right away, of like something in us, this desire to be like, I bought this artistic thing and it has value and here it is, like, this drive. I think it's really neat where it started from. And I also really love, I popped off camera to grab something, your reference about like this movement and them saying something within it and hidden clues. And I went and grabbed one of these boxes that I got when in Russia, Pollock art. And these they had to deviate into folktale away from any religious references. And so what's the characters presented, that was one of their ways of providing some expression as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gina, for sharing your collection.
Thanks for letting me.
And I love the story. I never knew the why and how it started. So that truly is, I think it does, like Ellen said, it speaks, I think, to so many people. And it's also, I think, how you've grown it over the years. It's relatable, right? Like I don't know anyone that set out to buy a collection like in and of itself, but for us, you put the pieces together over time, and it creates this beautiful, beautiful story as you go through it.
I should also mention they're all over the house. So my husband is very used to them now too. And they're my story, but he has his sports stuff somewhere else. So it worked out.
Love it. Mixing collections.
Exactly.
Lots of excitement, Gina, in the chat about your collection. And I think
thank you.
It's really just fun to hear someone be passionate about something like that. Like I was thinking, I'm so used to hearing about collections like these being sports memorabilia. I think that's an area that I'm at least much more familiar with people having vast collections. I come from Green Bay, Wisconsin. You wouldn't believe what people collect, right? Like huge collections, and they're passionate. But it's fun to hear about that kind of passion in a very different lens.
Thank you.
Excellent. And now turning it over to Tanzy, who's going to share with us The her unique philosophy on collections as a steward for the unidentified Black histories in the pieces she collects. Remember, she focuses on beautiful antique and vintage jewelry pieces. Tanzy, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here tonight.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Heather. It's such an honor to be here today. So basically with me, I definitely agree with what Sarah said, and I wanted to add as well, and also what Gina said as well. I personally feel like you have two different type of collections. You have the on purpose collection, and the where this came from. It's just everyone started, giving me these and I have like tons of it. So me personally, the purposeful collection, in my opinion, it can originate from numerous things. Family related. It'd be just like if you're fascinated with something, so you're like, I want to collect more of it. Like if you look at different aspects of decorative arts and also history, you have a lot of people who collect like Civil War items or different paraphernalia or something that's connected to a historical event. You also have a lot of collectors and preservationists that don't intentionally necessarily call themselves that, but if you preserve your family photos, or you have tons of, antique and estate jewelry from your grandma or your relatives' collection, you are collecting. So it's kind of like it could be intentional or, unintentional. With me, I have always loved jewelry. And so when I first started to do jewelry in 2017, when I was 24, I personally didn't have like a niche. I was just like collecting different jewelry, whether it was like Juliana jewelry, mid-century, modernist. And then I realized that I'm fascinated with antique jewelry, even though on a day-to-day basis, most jewelry I wear is either pearls or turquoise, but I'm fascinated with like the Victorian era, Art Nouveau designs, Edwardian era. And so I decided to specialize in that. And what helped me too was when I attended the Ashford Institute of Antiques for Decorative Arts. They were like, find your niche, what is something that you just love collecting. And then you can feel like you can spend time researching. So I think that's important too, researching it, taking time to properly research it. So I started to collect antique jewelry and sell antique jewelry. And then I also noticed that oftentimes, especially when you look at antique jewelry ads or just antique jewelry in general, oftentimes the Victorian era and the early 20th century, even with like Gibson Girl image, oftentimes Black people are excluded from that. And so I decided that, it needs to be proper representation because when I know for a fact, me and other Black people and just people in general, when you look at our family collections, you see, beautiful Edwardian era couples and Victorian people who were, dressed nice in the photos and who had fabulous jewelry too. So I wanted to correlate those two. I was like, that's missing in my opinion, the proper representation of including Black people in Victorian era trends and, during the early 20th century. So I first started on my Instagram just reposting collections from Library of Congress and, other public photographs. And then I started to collect my own. And then I realized that when I collected my own, I was like, I have enough where I can, write a book about it. My first book was about just like antiques when it comes to the art world, like when you see Black Moors and Renaissance paintings, and or oftentimes, we have seen these paintings where it was a Black person, and we're like, oh, who's that? In this Italian painting, and you're like, wow, who is this person? And so my first book was just more so about international art that features Black people. And then the second book, Unsung Portraits, the first book is called Hidden Legacies, African Presence in European Antiques. And the second book, Unsung Portraits, was about anonymous images of Black Victorians and our ancestors who we may not have a name to go with it, but it's so many details in that photo. Jewelry, dressed to their nines, just so elegant. And I was so inspired by that. So now I mostly post from the Tanzy Ward collection, which is what I do, my collection of antique photos. And I also correlated with, the jewelry they were wearing. Since I am an antique jewelry dealer, I'm like, oh, look at this fabulous T-bar brooch or, that this lady was wearing. Because I think the representation is very important. And I think oftentimes it's important to understand too when collecting that preservation is very important and representation is very important, because oftentimes back in the day, it was a very negative, like caricature based image of Black people. So when you see these photos, the photos that we have in our families, ancestral photo album, or just in general, we're like, this is accurate representation. So I think that's important. The other side of collecting as well is that I get it. I've talked to some people who they are like, well, this is my grandma's cupboard. It's taking up space. I don't really want it. Not necessarily they just want to just discard it, but some people may not care, about something, but I always say someone else will. Someone else is like enthusiastic about it. So with collecting, I think it's kind of like, okay, you're fascinated with it, but also even if you're not, it's a historical context and importance of it that it should be preserved. That I think that sometimes people disregard. So, seeing Black amber types, pictures of Black people, amber types and postcards and whatnot, or the very rare Black memento collections. I think that's important to collect and preserve, because oftentimes it's missing in, different collections and in history. And just to share some of my collection, like this one, for instance, is an amber type of a Black man. And when I seen it, I was like, wow, this is amazing, because I used to go on Library of Congress website and see the daguerreotypes and amber types that they had and the 10 types of Black people. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. So even though, and think about when you collect photos too, you're like, this could be someone that your relative may have known. Any one of us, this could be someone that's we're distantly related to. You never know, because they are photos that have not been identified. And then also, one of my favorites being an antique jewelry dealer is I love the photographic jewelry brooches that they wore. Oftentimes to honor a loved one or whatnot. So this is one of my favorites as well. Any photographic jewelry, just I really love. And then I also love to collect things that are connected to Georgia, because I have a lot of ancestors in Georgia. So when I found this ceremonial badge for a funeral, it was for Springfield Baptist Church in Georgia. It was one of the first Black churches in that area. And this is something that's very hard to come by when it comes to Black people history, because now these are popular, but when you actually have a mourning or memento piece that's synonymous with Black people, it's even, harder to come by. Like right now, Victorian mourning era pieces are very popular. But when you have like a piece that's directly related to, Black person, is even more rare, because oftentimes that's not emphasized, or in my opinion, you don't see that often. So when I find things like that, I'm like, oh my goodness, like a stick pin of like a Black Victorian lady, they're honoring her legacy or whatnot. Or just like maybe like a morning hair work piece, it's like, wow, it's just amazing. And so, like I said, I'm very passionate about it. I've always been very passionate about history. And I think that the word preservationist, a lot of people I've talked to don't realize that they are preservationists. When you are preservationist, you are also a collector of sorts. And so that's why I always tell people to take care of your family's albums, photos. Every generation needs a family genealogist who cares. Like my grandfather is one. I have several relatives, elders who I feel like they pass the torch to me. So I have like a whole ancestry account, and I collect and keep, World War One and World War II registration drafts of my relatives, and marriage, certificates and things, and pictures. My grandfather has a lot of the original pictures, but even if you have to digitize it, like I have the digital version, so I can just, like, if I want, print it and put it in like a convex glass frame or something. But just to have it, is amazing to me. And so it's something that I feel like it's very important to collect. just like what Sarah was saying and what you guys were saying though, like of course if you have like a 300 miniature pianos and you don't really care for it, then give it to someone else, I guess, who really wants to collect 300 pianos. I don't think we should force it on the next generation. So that's why, like, even with me, I'm like, well, if my descendants don't want certain things, then I can always donate it to like the Smithsonian Museum, or just make sure though that it's not just disregarded, or just damaged or whatnot. Because, sometimes people inherit things are like, wow, I'm not really into that, but there's also a historical context of it as well that's important. And then there's also things too that I feel like, well, it's your family's history. If it was family history related, like photos and letters and whatnot, I think it is important to collect, but you also have to understand that everyone may not have a positive relationship with an ancestor. I've heard people tell me before, oh, well, you can have it. I wasn't really fond of my grandparents. And, we have to understand that dynamic too. Everything is not just like, you know, this or that. Sometimes it's like deeply rooted, reasons why somebody wants to let go of something, but don't just throw it in the trash because one person's, oh, this taking up space is another person's. This is a collection that needs to be preserved. So.
See, that's a lovely thought. And we hear a lot of that coming from the genealogy world in particular about being a good steward, right? And so being a good steward in some cases does mean opening that up for a discussion with others who might be interested in something. I think it's lovely. We have a few questions for you that popped in. So I want to send them your way so that you can address them in sequence that you would like. One question is, how are you documenting the history and that of these objects like the funeral ribbon? The second question is, where do you go to find these types of items that you are collecting? And the third question, sorry, I'm scrolling. Oh, what happens if you identify the unidentified? There you go. 3 questions for you.
Yes, that is I love those questions. Thank you. So first and foremost, proper research is important. I don't always, that's why I don't tell people, oh, just research, because it's actually like a lifestyle researching. Like it's like academics and people like spend, that's their career researching. So I will say that research is important, but make sure that I try to research it properly. Like there are some things that I have curated that I've gotten history from the person who I've collected it from. And then there's some things that, like with the ceremonial badge, I researched it, and then when I researched it, I found out about, Springfield Baptist and Greensboro, Georgia and whatnot. And also, when I was in school for decorative arts, it was talked about different like research aspects and, whatnot. So I think that's important. I think that when you're really passionate about something and fascinated, you can go down a rabbit hole. Like sometimes I spend hours on online archives because I'm like, wow, or like I'm looking at like a street that, is now another street in Atlanta, but it was like someone else's home in the 40s or 30s. I go down a whole rabbit hole. Like I found so many things related to just in general history and also my family's history that I'm like, research, so that's something that I definitely do. Also, even if you're not professionally trained in it, when you research something and you collect something in particular that you're very fond of, you start to pick up on things that you kind of know about. I think everyone knows what I'm talking about, like antique collectors. Like, like with antique jewelry collectors, we know that when it comes to a brooch, if the back of the pin extends further, then that means it's probably older. That like a pin on the back, if you look at the clasp, mechanism of it, or you can like, okay, this is Art Nouveau. I can tell by this and that. So it's like when you start collecting things over and over again, you kind of can tell, the difference when it comes to certain things because you're naturally interested in it. So I would definitely say researching is something that I definitely do a lot. And the second one is, I'm sorry, what's the second question?
Where do you go to curate your collection? Where are your haunts?
Okay, good question. So before COVID, it was estate sales, and then after COVID, oftentimes it's bidding, and also there are a lot of bidders or people who bid who sell in bulk to antique dealers. So that's something that I like do is like I look at it, you know, okay, like I know it's like several pieces in here that, you know, I can definitely like, you know, I love it all. And I would have to say definitely like honestly, you guys, when it comes to these antique photos, you know, eBay, you know, I'm not afraid to say that. I always tell people where I get a lot of my stuff because I want more people to collect it. People who care about the history, because there are tons of antique photos out there that are just waiting for someone to preserve it in a home, you know, for it. So I think that's very important. I love eBay. So that's something that I do. My antique jewelry, a lot of estate sales, also someone in particular that I work with that sells directly to antique dealers, so like wholesale collections and whatnot. And then when you build relationships with people, they're like, oh, you know, I have something that my great grandmother had and was putting out the attic. So that's something, you know, that I'm very fond of. And then last question is, yes, let me tell you guys a story. So most of my antique photos are never, no one reaches out to me and says, oh, this is my kin. But there was one photo that was from an Auburn Avenue photo center that was very popular back in the day. It was like a photography studio on Auburn Avenue, which is a historic Black neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia. And I remember it's so funny because the world is like big but small. But so I had a lady reach out to me when I posted it on my Facebook, someone I'm Facebook friends with and I'm acquainted with. She was like, I know these people. This is my family. It's a photo of three ladies. They were pictured at the Auburn Avenue photo studio. And then she got me in touch with one of her relatives. She told me the background story. The background story is incredible. They knew people like W. Du Bois. The father was one of the first professors at Clark Atlanta University, or Clark College, what it was called back then. And so it was just amazing, the history. And I was like, how did this end up being bid online? And it's heartbreaking. Basically, they trusted their estate from an estate liquidator who they told them not to mess with those box of photos. And apparently the estate liquidator took the photos, and then the person, she resold them at a market. And then the person who I bought it from got in touch with it, and it's so crazy and so sad because it makes me think about all the antique photos I see online. I'm like, I'm pretty sure their loved ones isn't just like, okay, anybody can have them. You know, these are people's loved ones. But I will say this, that when I did reach out and say, well, you guys can have this one back, they were like, oh, we already have copies of it. So it's multiple copies out there. You know, back in the day, when real photo postcards were out, they would send those postcards to different family members with, you know, little messages on it, you know, for, you know, holidays and whatnot. So they were just like, oh no, you can keep it, because they knew me. They know that I preserve photos. I try not to resell them like on the market. I sometimes do donate my daguerreotypes to people who I know who are preservationists who will take care of it, but I don't like to resell these photos. So they were like, oh, you can keep it. I decided not to put it in my book because it's not an anonymous image, but the story behind it was amazing. I had like a whole 2-hour conversation with the lady. And so that was the only time that someone actually reached out and said, I know these people. And oftentimes nobody reaches out, because one thing about unidentified photos, we never know who we're looking at. It might be a photo that we've seen that could be someone in our family, all of us, someone in our ancestral tree, or someone that knew someone that we were, or are related to. But you'll never know, because now don't get me wrong, some photos, especially postcards, they have like on the back, oh, this is Ruby when she was 5 in Mississippi. And that's lovely. And then sometimes you have too the photos, the cabinet cards that has the photography studio on it. But then oftentimes a lot of these photos, especially Victorian photos, they don't have any names or anything on it. So, we can be like, oh, that looks like so and so, but you never know. You might have a picture that somebody you could be really related to, or they may have known your loved one. And that's why I try to preserve them and not like resell them, because I feel like it's important to preserve them. And if anyone ever reaches out to me and they're like, oh no, I know this is my great great grandparent, I'm like, oh yeah, you could definitely have this photo if you want.
That is so beautiful, Tansy. Like that just the way that you described the why, the history, the feeling of connectedness, even if you don't know the individual, but understanding the historical perspective and the context, that is so beautiful. And you're getting, I think, a lot of just love comments here in chat. We have someone who wrote in saying your Instagram is really awesome. They've always wanted to look through old photos at antique stores. Always so interesting. Think of the stories in those pictures. I think you really did, touch some hearts and minds out there tonight. Yes, and another member just wrote in saying that they initially stumbled upon your account with the display of cameos, and I'm sure there's stories and histories behind those. Before we wrap for the evening, we do have one more question from one of our audience members. Karen would like to know what collections or artifacts we all have. As a designer, she likes to see the collections clients have. So I'm curious, who'd like to start? All right, Sarah.
I will go because it's kind of an interesting answer for me. Since I work with other people's collections all day, I find that in my personal space, I tend to like a little bit less object density to refresh the palette. And so I don't have a lot of things in my house. I'd say the greatest quantities of objects I have are plants and reference books. But I've really sort of turned it into a concept of every object I use, I want to be beautiful. And then that is the collection, like my fountain pen, which I love using, my, coffee mug, which I love using. And so it's more a collection of in the William Morris way, everything has to be beautiful and useful. And I will say though, I do have a collection of Heath ceramics, which are my everyday dinnerware that was built up over 15 years, very slowly, like literally plate by plate, because I was very poor. And it's my everyday dinnerware. And so I'm loading the dishwasher, I get to interact with it. I'm eating off of it, I get to interact with it. It makes me happy every single time. And it's also to that greater why, and kind of Tansy was saying with the family and the lineage. On my mother's side, we were in the San Francisco area since the gold rush. And so Heath Ceramics is a really iconic Bay Area ceramic studio. And it also ties in with a lot of other elements of my life, in that Edith Heath was really famous mid-century modern designer, female entrepreneur. And so it kind of dovetails, strangely enough, with all of these passions I have in my life. And so that's again that biofeedback of when you can surround yourself and use things every day that are just really precious to you and make you happy with their beauty. It does something internally that's very positive.
That is so beautiful, Sarah. Gina, do you want to share another one of your collections, or Tansy, or?
I'll tell you really quickly. So during COVID, we moved from a 1826 farmhouse to a 2003 colonial, and we downsized dramatically. And now so I got rid of a ton of things. But what I do now is I try and slip in little things that don't look like they should belong, but they do, just fun little items. And I've been artifacting. I have a big passion. I grew up in New Jersey, so I'll just admit that. And I have a big thing for Springsteen. And so I try and sneak little Springsteen things in the house while still looking elegant. And so I have like tiny little pillows that I have printed. They look beautiful, and no one has ever noticed that really tiny. They're the lyrics to his songs and things like that I've had custom made. And so I do a lot of little collecting of things, but I put them in a way that doesn't take away from us having a grown-up house. And so that's what I'm working on now with Artifacts, is I'm artifacting my love of Springsteen over 40 plus years. So
wait, should I not admit the childish collections I have? Because I do. I have rocks from all the places my family and I have traveled.
Whoa.
They're in planters and they're hidden here and there. And I literally have toys too. So I have like a top, and I have a jar full of sand, like these things that are playful. And as you come through my home, you can experience them, you can interact with them. And it just brings me joy when I see them. So I do have these very classically childish collections.
I knew you were going to jump in with that, Ellen. I love it. I've been to her house and it's like there's joy in every room. It's so delightful. On my end, I tend to be more of a minimalist, yet I'm married to a maximalist. But one of the collections I do have happens to be cookbooks. My mother was an amazing cook, and it was truly her love language. Being a good New Englander, emotions weren't really high on our list of things we ever talked about. But if she wanted to show that she loved you or was thinking about you, she would bake you something from tea breads to cookies to, she'd cook a 5-course dinner. That was her love language. So I think I inherited from her not only my love of cooking, but my love and appreciation for cookbooks. So I have cookbooks from all the places I've traveled, places I've lived. I do use them, so I do maintain they are highly functional. But they are little reminders of bits and pieces of me and also my mother to pass down our family story and our family tradition.
Tanzy, do you want to wrap us? What's one of your other collections you want to share?
Definitely. So I am a random but intentional collector. So I'm also a vintage enthusiast. So I have different collections. Even modern things like if we were going to like the beach or something, collect like seashells, like that's something modern. But also like I like mid-century clothing, even though like I love researching the Victorian era when my everyday wear is not Victorian. So I like union label tags. Look for the union label. Like I love that. Like I love a good mid-century knit. So like anything with a union label tag on it. Also, I love what's like mid-century brooches, box purses. People always ask me where I get my box purses from, Poshmark and eBay. And they're relatively like kind of cheaper than like a lot of modern purses that are like really cute. Like you can get them for $30, $40, like the marble box purses and with sometimes with the seashells in it and stuff. So I love box purses and and of course art too. I love art. You can find some good art, at reasonable prices, and that's what I love. Like I remember one time I was at a Goodwill out in North Georgia, and I found an antique painting. That's one thing too about when you collect things and you like research. You're like, okay, this person donated this here, but I know this is like, so I got it for like $10. So like I have like random collections. I try not to be a hoarder, definitely not like a minimalist, but I'm not like, oh my gosh, like why is this random alligator statue or something in here? Like so it's not nothing like that. But I definitely have random collections because I am like I guess a true collector at heart.
I love it. I'm just imagining the alligator statue.
So we got from roosters to alligators to close the evening. Here we go.
So with that, I do want to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Sarah, Gina, and Tanzy for sharing your expertise, your experiences, and your collections. Thank you for our audience. We're getting a comment from Judy. Don't knock the alligators. She has a friend with a 6-foot bear in the living room. Well, that is something. She should probably
have the Beanie Babies show up again. There's the Beanie Babies are alive and kicking. Sorry. Okay, close the show.
Looks like Beanie Babies are still alive and in people's collections. But on that note, folks, thank you so much for joining us. As always, you can watch the recordings on our YouTube channel. That's simply at Artifacts. Check out all of our wonderful panelist informations. We have it in chat. We will be including it with the links to the recording on the YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and visit Sarah or Tanzy's websites or their Instagram accounts, all that information will be linked to the YouTube video. So thank you so much for joining us for concluding the spring finale of Evenings with Artifacts. And we will look forward to seeing you all in the fall. But until then, thank you so much and have a great night.